Oh, welcome to a small workshop about lava terrains. So this is what we used in Project GROT to generate terrains and also have some lava on terrains. I will go over this by first this small presentation and then I will show it in Houdini. So on the schedule, I will start from a very basic level. If you're already familiar with Houdini heightfields and terrains, you can skip part 1 and go to part 2 where I talk about lava. So for part 1, I will assume you don't have much experience with, for example, terrains. So I will take my time to explain some of the terrain features in Houdini. And in part 2, I will then use that terrain that we make in part 1 to then simulate lava on top of it. Now, first of all, if you're new to this, terrains, heightfields, landscapes, what are all these terms? Essentially, you could say that they are quite similar in what they do, is making a terrain. Now, heightfields is what we call it in Houdini. So if you would type in terrain in Houdini, you won't find anything close to it. We call them heightfields in Houdini. So these are the names of the nodes we will use in a moment as well. In a more technical term, these are 2D volumes where each voxel or the grid basically has a certain value. So we have a 2D plane, and you can say they have pixels, and each pixel represents a certain value, like the height, for example. So a terrain or a height field is basically like a flat area, a flat plane, and it can move up or down. That's how often games do it with themselves as well. So in Unreal, Unity, or other game engines, they have this landscape tool or terrain tool, and you can just simply paint terrain to move up or down. So some benefits to this is that this has been used for years. This has been a common workflow for many time, like a very long time. And it's also well optimized. So there have been optimizations applied to the specific way of working where we can dynamically change resolutions, things like that, to make the height fields or the terrain more optimized. A few downsides of this is that it will make it very difficult for us to do like a cave because the height field only goes up or down. So there's no like intersection in the middle with a cave or something. It only moves up or down, which makes it very 2D in some ways. In the end, what we will do is actually have a height map. So we will have a flat plane and we will move it down based on a height map, essentially. That's sort of how you can imagine it. We can also export these maps in an actual texture. And the only thing, if you do this, is you make sure the bitrate is high enough, like 16 or 32-bit rates as a texture. Because this could be a very large map, and any type of compression is something that you can actually see on a large map. So this is essentially a height map, and we project it onto a simple plane. And from there, we have like a terrain type way. So in Houdini, we can generate these height structures or terrain structures. So a few industry examples. I took two examples that you can actually also watch GDC talks about or more talks about because there have been, of course, quite common. So first of all is the Far Cry 5 example. So any game with any type of open world has to use this type of landscape terrain generation work. So with Far Cry 5, they generated the terrain, and on top of that, they then also scattered assets around. So Far Cry is a big world, and to manually ask someone to make every single hill or every single dirt patch would be a long time to produce that. So basically they generate parts of the terrain automatically, and then also the placement of these assets are based on the terrain. So based on how the terrain is generated, the adaptation of asset placement will also be changing to that. Same for Ghost Recon, Wildlands, and Breakpoints, is they also have terrain tools in place. So again, you can see from the image, a large area, large open world, and to do everything by hand would take a long time. So they have generators in place to create all these terrain data, and also then the scattering of the assets can also be automated in some ways. So these are two examples that if you would Google, you can find more information about. But for now, I'm going to go further with our Houdini. So now let's get started with some examples in Houdini. So I will spawn a few different nodes. So the noising, the blending, the masking, erosion. I will talk a bit about some of these nodes that are commonly used to build height fields. I will of course explore first of all noises and blends. How can we apply different noises? How can we blend noises? Things like that. Also a bit about masking. How can we mask specific areas? And then some other things like a terrace, slump, and flow. And then to like finish off that part one, I will talk a bit about the erode node. So that will be part one, and I will now go into Houdini. So if you have Houdini open, we can just press our tab here, so tab, and then we're going to type in height field. So we can place a height field node. So in here we can double click, and now we are actually in the height field node itself. So make sure you are on the geometry layer. You can also gonna press spacebar G to view our full height field, as you can see. So like I mentioned in the presentation, height fields is just a simple plane, and we're gonna move it up or down by different noises and things like that. So the height field itself, the only thing you need to know about the height field is the size. So this is 1000 units by 1000 units. So I think one unit is like 1 meter. So this is like 1 kilometer in size. So it's pretty large. And we then also have the grid size. This is the resolution. So if I view the information of my height field, we basically have like a texture that's like 500 by 500 pixels. That's how you could try to imagine it if you are not that familiar with these voxels. So we have a 500 by 500 resolution. And basically the grid spacing 2 means that it will take the size and divide it by 2. So if we change this to 1, you can see that now our value is 1000. We can also change the size to axis specific, and this can be used to type in very game specific resolutions like a 512 resolution. And this will now be a 512, for example. So it's not that important. The only thing I would say is like start with a resolution that's acceptable. Don't start with a resolution that's already too detailed, but start something with like 500 in this case, or maybe a bit higher if you want to. So this is the node where it starts from, and then from here we're going to go into the noises. So we're going to spawn a height field noise, and in here, as you can just plug it in like so, it will apply noises on your terrain. So you can see that by default it will add a lot of noises. And let's talk a bit about this node. One of the first things that I want to do here is I'm actually going to go to the fractal and disable it. So you can see this is the actual noise type. So the noise type is basically what we see now. The fractal is basically an additional sort of like looping or iteration to add a detail, which is very useful. But to get you more familiar with noises in Houdini, I recommend just turning it off for now. So here are the settings to boost it. So amplitude will boost it, and the size will then here make sure we have a smaller or bigger size. So if you want to create something like a desert, this would be great. So we can like here have like some type of desert. We can also stretch the scaling here. So let's say we press a 2, we can now start to scale this. And now we can sort of like maybe start creating a desert by this noise. So it's important for you to understand all the noises. So let's talk a bit about different noises. So here we also have like a Perlin flow, which also again looks a bit wobbly, not really defined. But the more interesting ones, so here there are a few ones you can try as well, but the more interesting ones are here, these ones at the bottom. So we have a whirling noise, which is often used for mountains and terrains. As you can see, it looks very, very much like a mountain shape. And on top of that, we also have another whirling, which looks more like a rock. Maybe I can lower the intensity a bit and change the scale. So this looks more like rock shapes. So if you want to generate some rock elements, this feels really like rock. And then we have the Manhattan. You can see quite very specific, quite more like sci-fi. And then some other ones like a Chevy noise, which also looks a bit more like a sci-fi, very clean lines. So I recommend you playing around with some of these noises because they're very interesting to explore. Every time you're building a terrain, I would recommend just going through some of the noises and see what you can come up with. Now, and this is only the beginning. So the reason why I removed this fractal is if I enable it back again, you can see how much change is applied to this now. So we have the standard noise, which as you can see will add a lot of different shapes to it. So we basically got rid of our original shape now. So we want to make sure if you go to this mode, you can also here lower the roughness so it's not breaking up too much. So if you want to apply a little bit of noising, you can make it more subtle with the slider. You can also check out the other ones, which is the terrain, for example. This one is, for example, feels a bit more focused on the higher peaks of the terrain. So it's not everywhere. So we still have this nice flat area here in the middle. And we have like some dirt on the peaks, which is actually nice to break up that perfect shape. And then we also have like a hybrid. And then as you can see, we can play around with this as well. It also breaks up these peaks a bit here and there. So if you play around with different noises, we can see you will have different results. So if I here change to some of these different methods, we can see that we have like different results. Yeah, so often I would go with a terrain or a hybrid terrain because the standard one is maybe a bit too much often, as you can see, in noises. So from here we have now, for example, let's say something basic, and some more settings is also here the post-processing and the distortion. So let's talk a bit about the post-processing. We can, for example, here use complement to invert the terrain. So you can see we're inverting terrain. So where we had the peaks, will now suddenly be the lowest part of my terrain. So this makes it like almost like a hobbit area. We can also here have like some contrast sliders, so we can boost and tweak the values. As you can see, we can do something like this. So we can really fine tune specific areas to be more flat and only have the peaks. We can also have it clipping if you want to have the clipping 0 to 1. And then we also have some distortion, which can be very useful again to break up the base shape. So here we can play around. You can see it's distorting the shape a bit. A really nice trick is actually increasing the frequency to a higher value, let's say 4. And now you can actually see more details into this. Like if you don't put this value too high, you can actually have like nice details into this terrain as well. And this looks like a really cool terrain already. Very chunky, rocky shapes. There's also another gradient. But these are a few settings that I want you to understand in this node. So this is very useful to understand what type of features we have. So instead of building complicated networks, you can maybe find some ways to enable these and play around with this. So that's a little bit about this node. And I want to start with a very specific version of the node. So I will build a version, and you can have the same values if you want to follow along. Another thing that I've not talked about is also here at the top, we have a center button. So this will center the terrain, but often what we want is our terrain is actually now downwards, which means that if I would have a water, the water would be at level 0. Our terrain will be covered by it. So I'm going to disable the center of it. And we're going to basically only move our terrain up rather than down. This will make sure in the future things will be a bit more easier. So let's, for example, for the amplitude, let's do 230. You can have the same values, or you can just play around with whatever you want. Then 250 for the sizing. So we have something like this. Then we're going to stick to a Worley noise, because that's always really nice. Then we're going to go with the hybrid, and then 0.4 as roughness. Then important will be the gain and the bias. So let's go to something like this, like almost 0.7. And then here on the bias, let's maybe indeed do 0.3. So what I want to do now is, or I want to create now is, I want to have like a very flat part, which could be covered by dirt, and I want to have the peaks still out there. And this will be the terrain I'm going to use to play around with. And these other values again are to you. Like if I enable and disable the warp, you can see the details adding and removing. I'm actually liking the warp, so I might actually keep it here. So these are some of the settings you can have for this. So this is a base layer of my terrain. You can also here use the offset to have some variations. So let's say offset by 400, you now have a little bit different shapes. What is then interesting to do is, let's say we want to add or combine noises. There are a few ways of doing that, and one way is to use a blend node. It's actually called a layer node, so a heightfield layer node. This is actually used to then blend the noises. So here, heightfield noise. And let's say we are now, if I go here to another Worley noise, let's say this one, I'm going to set to none, and let's grab it like so. We can now here use this node to blend these shapes together. So here, by default, it's going to replace the first with the second. So we don't want to use replace, but we can, for example, do add. So it's now adding on top of each other. You can do subtract, so it's subtracting, difference, multiplying or maximum. So I actually want to use the maximum. And if you remember, we also want to make sure that everything is actually off-center. So I'm going to disable the centering here again. And now you can see we're blending that noise. So I can actually play around with this. And you can see it's only blending on specific areas. So I can maybe lower here the intensity a bit. So we can have something like this. So we're now blending this rock shape. So we are breaking up that grass layer or the flat area with maybe some more rocks. In a moment we can add some more shapes into that. Another way to blend or combine noises is just simply stacking them. So height field noise, and we can just simply apply an additional noise. So as you can see, we're adding a noise on top of this. So there is also a blending mode here called add. So here we have the same blending modes as well. But sometimes it's nicer we have additional sliders here as well in the layer node. So I can always do some very specific tweaks here as well. So if, let's say we want to break up the terrain a bit, so I like the fact that it's making the terrain less flat, so we're breaking up the shape, but I don't like the noise, so that's why I'm going to disable the noising, and we're just basically going to use this to like break up the height. And at this point, it's also maybe a good idea to give your nodes names. So for example, this is the, let's say the mountains, and this is then the rock ground. And this could be, for example, then a height variation. So whenever you go back to this network, you exactly know what each node is doing, so you don't have to guess. Another cool trick is that, let's say we want to scatter smaller rocks in between this, is we can basically copy paste this, and we're going to make it way smaller, and we're going to do another layer node here. And now, for example, we can spawn these smaller rocks in between. So based on this value now, maybe I can lower the intensity here. We can start to now blend these small rocks in here. It's maybe a bit too small detail for now, but this is just one way of doing that if you're interested in adding some smaller details. So we have now some smaller rock patches in there. Then after that is done, we do our height variation. So it's easier to add this detail here because it's super flat. So I don't have to do any special calculations. It's just a flat plane, so I can easily scatter some data there. So here now we are going to then deform that. So that's a little bit about different noises. The only thing that I want to say is the distortion, and then I'm going to move on to masks. So we can here apply height field distort, and you can see it does add some nice detail on the terrain, as you can see. So it does make it a bit more terrain-like. But in generally, what we can do here as well is if we lower the roughness and we boost here the amplitude, you can see the effect that it's actually doing. And this is actually a really cool effect. So we can change the size of this, and we can, for example, do some warping like so. So this could be really cool. And then we can basically copy paste the distort node again and go back to its default settings. And we are applying again that basically the roughness, maybe a little bit less, because I do like some of the roughness details adding. So this is maybe too clean, and this is adding some nice roughness detail into it. So that's a little bit about noises and distortion. So these are like the most common nodes to use to make something simple over terrain like this. Now, on top of this, we can now start to think about masking. One of the most simple masks is the mask by feature. This is very common used, so height field mask by feature. And it will basically, like it said, has certain features that we mask. For example, here the base one is the slope. So we can mark the slope areas. So everything that's like at a certain degree will be masked. So all the mountains are now masked, basically. We also have this ramp if you want to control more about this. But basically, this is a very useful one. We also have the height. We have to press the button to calculate the height, but we can quickly here mark specific areas of the height field based on the height. We can also have the curvature, which is also very useful. Sometimes I do want to play around with the slider myself here. And you can see we can nicely get some of these peaks and valleys. So in case this is very useful for scattering or prop placement, or even for texturing as well, to have like very specific details in areas. Then we have the direction. This is basically you applying like a direction, and it's basically going to mask from there. So if you want to mimic the sun, and we can spawn more assets where the sun is growing the foliage, that could be done by this mask. And then the last one is also a really cool one, which is the ambient occlusion. I often like to invert this by this button and then boost the values like so. So this is then ambient occlusion. So this gives us a really cool mask for certain elements. For example, if you want to scatter assets here, this is a really cool way to like scatter some assets as well. Now we can do the same thing by combining masks. So let's say we go back to the slump or the slope, and we have now this area. And if we copy paste this mask node, and let's say we swap it to a ambient occlusion, we can now combine the masks with a, for example, a multiplier. So now we have multiplied these two masks with each other. And from there we can do a noising, for example. So this is a mask that we are making. And if we want to use this in a noise, let's say I want to scatter a noise, another attribute noise, we can basically use the second input, which is marked here as a mask, like so. And you can see that we are now specifically targeting the noise on that mask. I probably want to disable the center here again, and I'm going to lower here the amplitude. Maybe I'm going to change this to whirly noise. So we have some rock shapes in there. So you can see we are now creating these additional rock shapes on the terrain, basically, or on the cliffs. Now, the transition is maybe very harsh in some cases. And what we can also do is we can blur the mask slightly. So we have a mask blur node. So we can plug in a blurring over here. And here we can start to, as you can see, blur the mask. So it's like a less intense. So you can see that the transition will now be better if we start to blur the mask. As you can see. In case you want to get rid of the mask, because sometimes it's not always that readable, we can also just mask clear. So we can clear away the mask. And now if I would go back to my blur, you can see the effect it's giving us. So it's up to you if you would like to have these rock shapes in there. You can see it does add some nice detail here for this cliffs, basically. So it makes it a bit more rocky. So it gives us a nice rock detail or a bit more variation in the rocks. And this is how we can again use a mask. So we're calculating a mask and we're driving the noises with this. And this is just one simple example. So often again, the second input of a node or height node is for masking. Another cool mask technique or idea is the flow fields. So we have a height fields, flow fields. If we just plug it in like so, it actually calculates a certain flow. So the node itself, you can actually see it's called rain. So it's simulating a rain on the terrain. And what we see is basically the rain falling down. And we can actually see this better in the iteration. So if we lower the iteration to, let's say 5, we can see it's simulating like raindrops. So these are all like raindrops on the terrain. And over time, so the more iterations, over time it will then spawn more rain, or the rain will follow down the terrain. And the default is 200. So you can see that at some point you will have that. So this is again very useful if you want to do something special for scattering, texturing, or specific noises that you want to do. These are all very useful to combine with. So that's a little bit on the side. We also have another node called the terrace. This is sort of creating the stepping effect, which in some cases could be useful. So you can see it's like stepping the terrain. So we can compute the height range, for example, and then we can, for example, control how many steps we have. So if you ever wanted to do sort of like some type of stepping, this is how we can do it. You can also have some fading with this. So in case you want to blend this together, you can see we can blend this. We can also control this by a mask. So if I would use the masks that we had from here, you can see that we're now only creating the stepping area specifically in those sloped areas. So again, this is how you should use it. It's like masking specific areas for this. So you have some of this stepping going into it, because definitely at some terrain areas you see some of this stepping going on. So it's up to you if you want to keep this. I might just leave it here on the side. And then one more other thing that I do want to apply is something which is called the slump. So slump. And this is very useful to simulate like sort of like a dirt layer on top of your terrain. So by default, if you plug it in, it won't do anything. Like it doesn't change anything. So I can remove the node, it doesn't apply anything. So it requires a mask. And we're going to use a mask by feature again. And in here, what we want to do is we want to mask the flat areas. So everything that is very flat. And we can invert the mask basically. And now we can play around with some sliders here. And we can, for example, make something like this. And we can always tweak it. So these are all the flatter parts of the terrain. So if we now plug this in the slump, you actually see instantly it changed our masking as well. So let me clear the mask here as well, so you can actually see the results without the mask. So it's sort of like here, you can see it actually made everything here very flat. So it's simulating sort of like this dirt on top of it. So in some areas we still have this rock shape, and in some areas it made it flat. This is what I would sometimes use to like blend some like dirt feeling on their terrain. So if your terrain is too noisy or too rocky, like here we have quite nice rock shapes and noises, but sometimes you want to blend it with dirt. And this is again controlled by the mask, so I can always here control this mask, but based how much noise or dirt we want to have on the terrain. So I can control that nicely. We can also here have some iterations about how it should go, and you can play around with that. So I'm going to leave it as the default value. So now we have a terrain like this. And it's looking actually pretty nice. And what we often would do is when we are getting to a result that we really like, is we're going to apply it to in a road node. This will actually do a simulation. So if you plug it in over here like so, it might take a moment to calculate. And I'm going to enable here the freeze frame. So we'll calculate for 20 frames. And then after that, it will give me a result with simulations on top of it. So this might take a second. And here is the result. So you can see that it actually did like some water simulation here, and also like some debris on rocks eroding and just being destroyed over the years. I'm going to here disable the visualization for now, so you can actually see the result in clean geometry. So you can see we went from this to this. So it added a lot more interesting details on the terrain. You can actually see that it's nice when you flow on the terrain. We can always remove this. So 20 frames sometimes is a bit too much. So let's say we have 10 frames, and you can see it's like a little bit more subtle. We can always go to the main settings here and remove or set these settings lower. So we have the hydro and the terminal. So if we start to lower here the impact rate or the erodibility of it, we will have less impact of that on the terrain. But often this is very useful to blend the terrain a bit better together. So you can see this looks okay, but this looks a bit more blended together. Also the rocks usually feel more convincing. On top of that, we also have very limited resolution again, so we're only working with a 512. So in case you want to simulate this on a higher level, you can, but that might also add more noise depending on your settings. So let's say we are happy with this version now, and this is sort of my terrain. Now the second part is into the lavas of the terrain. So how do we add lava now on the terrain? We have a terrain that we've created now together, and we basically want to add lava. And there are a few ways of doing this, especially for games. Like this is always with some game related context. So what we used to do in games is often, or it's still a valid option, of course, is having like simple planes and using flow map data to drive the lava feeling in there. Another option could be doing actual simulations, like an actual flip simulation. This is of course very heavy because our terrain is quite large. That means that our simulation will be quite large, especially if we need the detail. It will be very, very slow. In games, we don't usually want to wait long on results. So we want to make sure we have something quite fast. So what I ended up doing is using the shallow water simulator. This basically is a simulation on the height fields. This is a 2D simulation driven on your height field by masks. So we will use the masks on our height field to create like a simulation. Simulation often gives us quite natural results, and you will see that in a moment. It will actually look quite nice based on some settings we apply to that solver, of course. So after we have our terrain now, so it's up to you if you use this terrain or something else. We basically, the first thing we want to do is draw a mask. I will just simply use the height field draw mask. You can also have other ways of creating masks, but I will just simply use the draw mask. So let's say I want to have like a lava that goes from the top to the bottom here, something like that. So I will grab my handle and I will draw a mask like this, something that goes like this. So we have a nice lava that will be flowing down from here. Now from this, a few things that I do want to do. So it looks a bit too perfect, and I'm going to do a distortion. So we've used the distort before, so height field distort. And we basically, instead of using the mask to distort, instead of the height to distort, we're going to use the mask. So here we can distort the mask. Maybe the roughness should be a bit lower. So we create now this very inconsistent way. So we draw this perfect line and then we just destroy it a bit or distort it a bit. Then we probably want to blur this slightly, so blur mask, just so we can then blend the simulation nicely. I think the default value is fine. And I do want to move my terrain down, because if we simulate this, it might fall everywhere. And I do want to move this a little bit down so it stays a bit in this area. So what I will do is I will do a layer, height field layer, and I will also do a transform. So height field transform. And the transform itself will just here simply do an offset downwards. And you will see in a moment how this works. So our first input could be here, this. Our second input will be the offset, and our last input needs to be the mask, which is also here. So you can see we're now moving this down a lot by the mask. So the transform here is basically here this offset of how far this goes. So I don't want this to be too much, so maybe like -4 or 5 or something. We can see it here on the side. Just so the water or the simulation happens mainly here instead of running everywhere. Now, once we have this, we can go and type in our simulator, so shallow water solver. We can just plug it in like so. And you can just already by default just press play. And you will see, or you will say like, hey, I don't see anything happening, but it is actually working. What I recommend doing is going into the outputs and go enable a visualization mode. So we're going to say color by water. And now suddenly we have water. So this is actually, as you can see here, simulating water falling down. Now, what it is doing as well is, if we go to the bindings, this is the data it is using for the simulation. So what is actually happening is that water is actually already there, because water is also an existing part of the erosion node. So if I go back to this erode node, I can here remove the frames. If I go back here, we can actually see we have an actual already a water element here. So it already uses the water from this node into this simulation as well. So these nodes are right now talking to each other. We can simply remove this by deleting, for example, the water layer. So this is up to you if you want to delete the water layer. I will, for example, say here, delete water. And now if we go back here and we press reset simulation and press play, nothing is happening. Not much is going on. And that's great, because now I can actually focus on using my mask. So you can see that right now, all these bindings don't have mask in it. So I made it the red mask where I want this to be. So we can use a source as a mask. So we can just override this to be a mask now. Now, if we would reset the simulation, we can now see that we have the lava flowing now. So exactly where we had the masking, we can now have this flow. So like I said, it's of course going to just flow down your terrain, and based on the settings, it will be less or more. So sometimes it will definitely create like a lot of waves and nice shapes, but we of course want to fill in some values. So I pre-made some values, and you can use the same if you want to. I will leave the gravity as it is. I will add a little bit of velocity here. So let's say 0.15. Then the time scale, I'm going to bump that up to, let's say, about 5. So we have like 5 times speed up simulation. Just because this works so fast, you can see we're speeding this up a lot. You can see we're also adding a lot of like water waviness into it. Like it really feels like a lot of water waves are coming very high. So let's solve that by here these settings as well. So we can also limit the speeds to the waves. So let's say we are limiting them by 2 and 4. And if you were to play again now, there will probably be a bit less intense. So you can see now it's a bit more natural to me, like less intense. So now it's not that heavy in terms of water going very quickly down and splashing everywhere. Another thing we can do now is also the sourcing frequency, or also here other settings. So the sourcing scale itself, maybe we can lower this. You can actually see, if you zoom in a bit here, maybe we can see it. If I lower this down to, let's say, 0.7. If I reset the simulation, let's see if we can actually see it. You can see it's like less upwards, so it goes less upwards, basically. We can also have the sourcing frequency, and what I will usually do is basically do once per frame. So for both of these, once per frame. I mean, we don't really use the sync, but so basically our source, we do it once per frame rather than on initialize only. And now we basically roughly have the simulation that I want. So we have these shapes. So this will be the lava flowing down in our terrain naturally. Now it still looks a bit boring, and the reason for that is the magic trick to make this happening is we need to add some noises on here. So maybe I even blur the ground here. So let's use blur like so. So we're actually blurring away those details. And we want to add new details in the ground, basically. So we're going to use a noise, heightfield noise, based on the mask. And we probably want to disable the center and lower here these settings a bit. Let's set this to 10. And the main thing that I want to do is, in here, let's enable all these toggles, and let's boost here these sliders. So let's see. So you can see we're creating like this noise. Maybe I can remove the mask so you can actually see it on full scale. So we're creating like this type of noising into the terrain now. So right now it's only finding, it's only sort of like about fine-tuning the values. Maybe it's even like this. Okay, so maybe we do need to enable the center, so it's indeed a bit more in that area. We can always like fine-tune this, but let's see how it now works in our simulation. If we reset the simulation, we can start to see nice shapes now. So it feels a bit more interesting. Again, we also don't have that much resolution to work with, but you can see we have like some lava parts, like it start to work. Now, the only thing to make it actually better is the visualizing mode is of course a water layer. So I'm going to right click on this node. I'm going to allow editing. And in here, I'm actually going to override the visualizer. So there is a node called here volume visualize. And I will override this to be a black body. And now you can see it's actually lava. So here on the visualizer, change this to black body. And then what I will do now here is I will also set the range from 1 to 5. And now you can see we have this lava effect. So we are remapping that range. 0 to 1 is not always that great. And now we can basically have the lava effect. And this is what I used in the final scene. So you can see we basically have the same effect now. And it looks really cool. Looks really natural. So from here, there are a few ways to now convert it. What I did is I just simply did a convert to geometry, so heightfield convert. And what it does is it still has some of the data stored in the node. So if I do a coloring, attribute color, and let's say color by attribute or color from attribute, and we're going to probably choose either, I think, mask or water. Let's see. So there's water. I'm going to use the 1 to 5 here as well. So we have the exact grayscale. This is what I would actually put into Unreal. So we can color the grayscale in Unreal. But we can also just here do a black body. And in this case, I can also here maybe turn this to be a bit more brownish or something. Maybe less saturation. And as you can see, this is now my lava terrains, basically. So this is sort of like a new idea that I tried to approach with this solver. And I think it works pretty well. It looks quite convincing. And from here, you can do whatever you want with this. You can also extract some velocity data, but maybe more on that in the next tutorial. But this is basically how you can do it like this. And you can now just draw where you want lava and it will simulate this. So I can always go back to my drawing board here. And let's say I want to have like a lava flow from here. It should be able to now catch that up here in the simulation. And now we have something like this. And that's how we can quickly add some interesting lava shapes and effects here. And that was it for this terrains with lava presentation. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you had some more context now how this was created. And see you on more of these tutorials. Thank you.